Welcome to Social Psychology, Chapter 1 lecture. Let's start off by talking about what social psychology is. Social psychology is that area of psychology that lives at the intersection of sociology and psychology. It's the scientific study of cognitions, emotions, behaviors of people in social situations and how those social situations influence our behavior. Remember, this is a science, just like the rest of psychology. People often underestimate the influence that social factors have on our individual behavior. Modern social psychology traces its beginning to the work of Kurt Lewin, who fled Nazi Germany. After World War II, Lewin was very interested in what made the Nazis behave the way that they did. Was it something about them, or was it something about the situation? And it turns out this led to a whole series of studies and even an entire field of psychology studying what the social situation does to humans' behavior. A classic example of this is Stanley Milgram's study of obedience. In this study, participants were led to believe that they were teaching someone a series of word pairs using increasing levels of electric shock. In fact, no one was ever shocked, and the supposed pain of the student was actually a recording by a professional actor. The shocks were delivered in increasing increments, which is important. People started off with a very mild level of shock. Remember, no one actually got shocked. And the shocks increased supposedly in intensity. Over the course of the experiment, the subject who was actually recording these responses, he was an actor, increasingly evidenced that he was in great pain up until he stopped responding altogether. Many of the participants wanted to stop shocking the learner and yet didn't when the experimenter, that is, a man in a lab coat, told them to continue. In fact, 2/3 of them gave the maximum amount of shock that existed on the machine, even though the learner had stopped responding. Here we see the supposed shock machine on the left, and on the right, the learner seated in the chair. This man was an actor whose name is lost to history. The experimenter on the right, and the teacher, quote, a participant who was in the study on the left. Despite the fact that people were predicted, really by a number of experts, not to go up to the maximum shock. In fact, most experts thought less than 1% of people would follow these instructions and give the maximum shock. Almost 2/3 of them actually did. We found the same effect for different people, men, women, people of different ages, people of different social classes. It's a very disconcerting finding. This is a classic example, though, of how powerful the situation can be. The participants didn't really want to be sadistic and harm somebody. However, all but 1/3 of them continued to provide shocks up to the point where the person may have been actually dead. And in fact, nobody ever got up to check on the learner without getting the permission of the experimenter. Another good example of the power of the situation occurred with a study of seminary students at Princeton University. Students were divided into a couple of groups. One group was told they were late for an appointment, either to prepare a talk about seminary jobs or to prepare a sermon about the Good Samaritan, which is a story in the Bible in which a stranger helps someone in need. On the way to give this talk, the students who were in a hurry encountered a man who was hired by the experimenters, who was slumped over in a doorway, obviously in need of help. And none of them stopped to help when they were in a hurry. Even the students who were going to give a talk on the Good Samaritan. This shows the really powerful role of situations in determining our behavior, and that situations can, in some cases, override our individual personality differences. You can see from the graph here, those seminarians who were not in a hurry, the majority of them stopped to help the person. Those who were in a hurry, only about 10% stopped, whether they were going to give a talk about careers or prepare a sermon on the Good Samaritan. One significant finding in social psychology is something called the fundamental attribution error. This is the tendency that we have when explaining other people's behavior to overemphasize personal differences and to neglect or underemphasize situational influences. That is, we tend to suggest that other people do things because that's the way they are. Dispositions are these internal beliefs and personality traits that guide people's behavior. When we're encountering someone else's behavior, we don't really have access to all of the external influences on their behavior. And so we tend to revert to the information that we do have. So that is, that's the way that person is. Nudges are a phenomenon that is of great interest to social psychologists. Channel factors is the technical word for this. Nudges are these kind of subtle influences that can guide behavior. One good example of this is organ donation. In jurisdictions where people have to opt in, that is, they have to choose to be an organ donor, rates of organ donation are fairly low. But in situations in which people are automatically signed up and have to opt out, they have to do something to change their license, their driver's license, to say they're not an organ donor, the rates are much higher of organ donation. Just the fact that you have to do something one way or the other has a big influence on people's behavior. Another example is retirement plans. Companies that have opt-out plans have much higher rates of participation. Construals are the interpretations we make about a situation, particularly ambiguous situations. For example, in the next slide, we're likely to see a triangle, even though there's not one actually there. There's no triangle here. There are three little points, but we tend to perceive it as one. We construe it as one. Gestalt psychologists made great use of these kinds of construals in studying human perception. Gestalt, which is from form or figure, is an approach that stresses that people automatically make interpretations about objects. These are non-conscious, they're automatic. Schemas are cognitive structures that we use to organize the world. In social psychology, the term is often used to describe our understanding of the rules of a social situation, such as how to behave at a funeral. Schemas can affect the way we construe a situation. For example, if we're at a funeral, we might expect people to be somber, quiet, respectful. Stereotypes are a related phenomenon. Stereotypes are assumptions we make about individuals or objects based on their group membership. For example, we might have a stereotype about apples, that they're all bright red. when in fact, some apples are much deeper red, some are pink, some are golden. So stereotypes are a mental shortcut, but one which causes us to ignore individual differences. Now, they can be helpful, right? We expect all cars to take us somewhere, right? That can be useful. That's a car, it's a vehicle, it can be used to transport people. But they're overgeneralizations, they're oversimplifications, and they can cause us to make assumptions about individual people or objects that are incorrect and lead us to trouble. Now, the way we think about the world, really the way we think about everything, happens in two fundamentally different ways. Much of the time, we're sort of on autopilot. We kind of go through our day and we don't think too hard about things. Sometimes, however, we have to engage our higher cognitive processes and change or moderate our behavior. So, in automatic processing, people behave in an unconscious, involuntary way. We often use implicit attitudes, that is, beliefs that we're not consciously aware of, but have a big impact on our behavior. In controlled processing, on the other hand, this kind of thinking is deliberate and effortful, and it can override our automatic responses, but it takes a lot of effort. These automatic processes occur without conscious awareness. For example, have you ever been driving home, you get home, and you don't remember the drive? You were sort of on autopilot. Now, there's a great advantage to be able to do things automatically. Walking, talking, and chewing gum are all processes that are much easier if you don't think about them. One recent but somewhat controversial influence on social psychology is evolutionary theory. Evolution by natural selection suggests that traits that are heritable are passed down more frequently when they result in a person or other organism having some advantage in survival and reproduction. Applying this to behaviors is sort of a new part of the approach and remains somewhat controversial since behaviors have multiple influences besides genetics. That being said, there are some relatively universal behaviors that occur across cultures, suggesting that these are behaviors that have been influenced by evolution. For example, across cultures, the husband is usually older than the wife. There's marriage in almost all societies. We treat people at different ages differently. Most societies have burial rituals, etc. Living in groups has an evolutionary advantage for any species because it provides protection from predators and it allows people to cooperate to obtain food, shelter, and other necessary resources. It's possible that language was shaped by evolution as well. If you're in a complex group, it helps to have a systematized approach to communicating with other members of the group. Theory of mind is our understanding that other people have different beliefs, interests, memories, opinions than we do, that each person has their own separate mind. This develops slowly in childhood and may be one of the things that's impaired in autism. One of the dangers of the evolutionary approach is something called the naturalistic fallacy. This is the idea that things are the way they are because they should be, they must be. There are many different possible trajectories across human history. And each of these possibilities is influenced by multiple factors. There's no one single, things must be this way. This is particularly dangerous when applied to inequalities in human society. The naturalistic fallacy can cause people to overestimate or overemphasize the importance of biological factors in human outcomes. One relatively recent innovation is the advent of imaging technology that allows scientists to view the brain in action while it completes various tasks. Techniques for this include functional magnetic resonance imaging, SPECT scans, and PET scans. If we look at the brain from the side, this is called a sagittal section, or is depicted as a sagittal section in this drawing. We can see some areas that are particularly important in social processes. For example, the prefrontal cortex is involved in modulating behavior, inhibiting impulses, making judgments. The nucleus accumbens is part of the reward system, and the amygdala is the part of the brain that stores emotional memories and helps us to respond to changes in the environment, particularly threats. All of these areas do not develop at the same rate. For example, the risk detection modules in the brain are not well developed until early to mid-20s in most people. Whereas the reward centers, those that cause us to seek out rewards, particularly social rewards from our friends, are very well developed by adolescents. This may explain partially why adolescents tend to make riskier decisions than adults. Of course, another reason is when you get old like me, things hurt more when you injure them. One advantage of evolutionary approaches to psychology is that it allows us to explain the great variety of differences in human cultures for people who live in different environments that require different behaviors and characteristics to survive and succeed. One difference between cultures that is really along a continuum is that between independent, individualistic cultures and more communal cultures. In individualistic cultures, people tend to think of themselves as distinct entities. They tend to be hierarchical, competitive, and people are more concerned about their own outcomes than about the survival or the success of the group as a whole. Whereas in interdependent or collectivist cultures, fitting in is much more important. Successes are attributed to group membership rather than individual characteristics. We can see some of the other differences listed here. For example, the need for individual distinctiveness in independent cultures and the desire to fit in interdependent cultures. In Japan, there's a saying, the nail that sticks out will be hammered down. Let's not forget, though, that all behaviors have multiple influences. It's not just evolution or biology or culture or personality that influences behavior. It's all of these things. There are a couple of differences that stand out between relatively independent and relatively interdependent cultures. In independent cultures, people earn money based on their individual effort. And in interdependent cultures, economic cooperation is valued. Societies that are organized along family lines or kin lines tend to be much more interdependent in general. We can also mark societies along a continuum from tight to loose societies. Now, what does that mean? Tight societies have stricter rules, and the sanctions for violating them tend to be stronger. Looser societies tend to be much more flexible, and there's really not that much of a social sanction for not fitting in. And so we can see most societies somewhere along this continuum. For example, the United States is relatively in the middle of these. Not exactly, but relatively so. Societies or cultures also differ greatly in terms of gender roles. Now, while there are some consistencies, such as there's a universal prohibition against incest. Every society has distinct rules or norms for behavior by men and women, as well as individuals of other genders. Gender roles vary greatly, even sometimes within the same country or the same subdivision of a country. One thing to keep in mind while evaluating scientific research is whether the research has been done with a group of individuals who belong to a wide variety of cultures. You can't really generalize results from one type of culture to another. Much of the research in psychology, particularly American psychology, is done with weird societies, that is, those that are Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. That's a neat little mnemonic for remembering those. One way to think about the relationship between evolution and culture is that evolution provides a capacity for a wide range of behaviors, and culture is one of the influences that determines where along that range one falls. Social psychology and science courses in general should not only teach you particular facts. Honestly, you'll forget a lot of these facts. But what's important is you learn to think critically. Critical thinking requires deliberative effort, but it's a skill that can be learned. It's not innate. One of the exciting areas of research is that of the influences of social media on human behavior. This research is really in its infancy, and findings are sometimes contradictory. Stay tuned, there's more to be learned. Social psychology can help us to understand what makes us happy. We've identified some of the things that are related to happiness that we'll talk about in this course. Also, some of the ways that we can deal with stressors, and we'll talk about some of those as well. Thank you for attending to this lecture, and I'll see you next time.